How are we doing, everyone? This should be, I think, a very interesting interview. So, the state of Manchester United, it's been a pretty wild season so far, on and off the pitch for the football club. Erik ten Hag's had to deal with a lot. And we're about to get new owners. It's something that we've been waiting nearly 20 years for, ever since they came in until now. But it's going to happen. And February is a big month. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to have a conversation. Charles, I just want to say thanks very much for giving me your time today. Charles, if you could give the viewers a little bit of insight into background as to why I'm speaking to you. Effectively, you're an attorney. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. I'm an
Cool.
American.
So,
Sorry,
as I was
go.
going to say that you basically you know what you're talking about, and I don't. And us United fans, we want to know what's going to happen next, what will happen next, when it will happen. So if you can you give a little bit of a background to yourself as to why, well, your attorney background, and I suppose why you're knowledgeable on this particular subject?
Yeah. So, as a bit of background on me, I'm an American securities regulations attorney. So, I deal with the Securities Act of 1933 and 1934, and then the Investment Companies Act as well. So that's kind of where the base of my knowledge is. I'm fairly familiar, I like to think, with SEC regulations and how the trade of public companies operate. With regard to this particular situation, I'm also a diehard Manchester United fan, as I have been since I was about 10 years old. So obviously, I've been following this pretty closely, both from a professional and a personal standpoint.
Well, yeah, for us fans, I don't really need to bring you all up to date because I'm pretty sure you know exactly what's happened. The Glazers put the club up for sale in November. Well, strategic investment opportunities, they called it. The only thing we know to date is that Ineos have come forward and they've formalized their interest, and now they're being allowed to look at the accounts in a bit more detail. Obviously, Man United is a publicly limited company. There's annual reports, but I imagine they might have forecasts and stuff like that, which will give a little bit more insight into the actual financial conditions of United. Now, we know that Ineos have gone forward. We know that I think there's some US consortiums that have gone forward, but February, Charles, is supposed to be the month. We know that these bids get formalized. So what is the next stage in this process? It's obviously between November and now. Is it realistic, do you think, at this point, that we could have new owners by the end of March? Because that was always the aim, by the end of Q1. Are we kind of inside that timeline still?
So we're definitely in that timeline. I think these deals, so they can kind of take place at a variety of paces. So, for example, Chelsea, we saw when they were sold. Obviously, they're not a publicly traded company, but it gives you an insight into kind of the pace at which a football club can be sold, which ultimately is what we're dealing with here. And also, that deal was conducted by Rain Group, which is the same group that's conducting the Manchester United sale as well. So I think that gives us a decent amount of insight. So as of now, we're starting to see formalized bids come in. Ineos, as you mentioned, being the first one to kind of poke their head out. One thing we don't know is whether clubs or whether interested parties have to announce publicly that they're interested in this. Obviously, we've heard some kind of, for lack of better phrasing, behind the scenes chatter relating to, for example, Dubai. I've heard stuff about Saudi Arabian private investment as well.
Yeah.
So all of these different, we're kind of in the dark as to whether they have to formalize their offers publicly. There's nothing in the law that says they have to. It could just be, obviously Sir Jim Ratcliffe being a huge Manchester United fan. It makes sense that he would be public with his offer just from kind of a strategic standpoint. Obviously, get fans behind him. I know there are a lot of fans who, kind of view him as the more moral option compared to state ownership as well.
Yeah.
So there's nothing in the law that says that this has to be a public announcement as of now. In terms of timeline, obviously, Rain Group going with Q1 being the kind of their end goal to consummate the transaction. So I think right now we're probably we're in a stage where it's likely that companies, nation states, individuals, whomever is interested, they're obviously doing their due diligence. And so as a reporting company, Manchester United has to file quarterly reports with the SEC relating to their financial state, potential risk factors, just kind of all of this information. It's all publicly accessible via these SEC filings. And so the due diligence standpoint, a lot of it can actually be done before we get even bids. Companies who are interested, let's say Amazon's interested, just throwing that one out there because of obviously they're trying to acquire more of the Premier League streaming rights and things of that
Yeah.
nature. But if Jeff Bezos wanted to, he could tell his lawyers and his accountants, go check the SEC, tell me what you can tell me about their financials, and let's see if this is a viable option. Now, once you get done with that kind of initial due diligence that obviously these bidders are going to be doing, kind of on their own just with this publicly available information, then once they register interest with Manchester United, the next step will be unreported information. So ongoing financials will be a part of that because it's not
Yeah.
like Manchester United tell the SEC every single day, every single transaction they make. And so ongoing financials for the next quarterly report will be part of that due diligence, as well as potential liabilities that are not public knowledge. So this could be, if there's an additional lawsuit going on in the background or there's a threat of legal action, whatever that may be, those disclosures will be made not in the public eye, but rather they'll be made kind of behind the scenes as this deal, as the negotiations for this deal move forward.
So in your experience of dealing with the sales of corporations and working on these sorts of deals, how long does this particular period take when it comes to interested parties coming to the fore? Is it a little bit different because of the SARS of United? Is it hard to compare, or is it, as you say, because of the Chelsea situation, you can kind of directly compare?
So it's difficult to compare for me from a kind of personal standpoint. The largest deal I've worked on is a $212 million acquisition. And then, but there are certain things, I've done everything from, hundreds of millions of dollars down to, tens of thousands of dollars for these kinds of acquisitions. And there are some things that are in every single one of these contracts. Okay. So, for example, every contract, it doesn't matter if you were buying the smallest business in the world or the largest business in the world. The due diligence there's going to be a due diligence contingency, which is, again, you enter into a letter of intent, a memorandum of understanding, or sometimes it just goes straight into the actual purchase contract. That's very unlikely in this case, I think, especially because we know the Glazers are going to try and, milk the last few drops of cash out of Manchester United. So they seem to be positioning themselves. And so what we'll see during this period is, again, kind of due diligence taking place, review of financials, review of things behind the scenes. And under the contract, you can do that in any amount of time that you want. I've had deals where the due diligence contingency period was 9 months. I've had deals where the due diligence contingency period was 9 weeks, And so, and actually far shorter than that. I believe the shortest one I had was a 14-day due diligence period. And so it's hard to estimate just saying, okay, a deal's taking place. How long do we have? Again, going off of that Q1 standpoint, generally, I think it's February 2nd, I believe, day of recording.
Yeah.
And so if we're to get the deal done by March, I would expect that those contingencies will probably run by the end of run to the end of February, and then you would have a month to actually finalize and consummate the transaction. Also, because Manchester United is a publicly traded company, and again, we're dealing with the Securities Acts of 33 and 34. We also have to consider the fact that there are going to need to be underwriters and broker dealers involved in this deal. Obviously, Rain Group is going to take the lead on that, and they probably already have something in place. But the more parties that you have involved in these transactions, the more complex and drawn out they can actually be.
You've mentioned it there. So the due diligence is what we know is happening now. Everyone's getting access to a little bit more than the publicly available financials. What's the next step from that point? So say due diligence is all done, all the bids are sort of formalized behind the scenes. Is it at that point where the Glazers have to go, right, okay, this is who we're choosing as the new owners of Manchester United?
So under Rule 144 of the Securities Act of, I believe that's the 34 Act that 144 is under. But under Rule 144, once there's what's called a bona fide purchaser or a bona fide intent to purchase, that's when the reporting requirement kicks in. So at that point, Manchester United will have to notify the SEC. And also, I'll send you the link to this afterwards so you can put it in the description or for any viewers who are interested.
Okay.
So Form 144, excuse me, it's a standard SEC form, and it includes particular information such as the class of shares to be sold, the party to which the sale will be made, who the seller is, the nature of the transaction, all of these things. So the duty to report under 144 happens. It applies to both restricted securities, which are more or less your standard kind of private equity trades, so non-publicly traded company, but also to control shares. And control shares are defined as shares held by an affiliate of the company, so in this case, the Glazers, who have decision-making power. Generally, it's over 10% equity in the company, or affiliates as in board members, insiders, so on and so forth. That also gets us to or Form 5, pardon me, under the SEC. And Form 5, you have to file within 10 days of consummating the transaction. And so that's whenever an insider in a company, so again, we're dealing with the Glazers here, sells their shares. And so within 10 days of that actually happening, then there will be a second duty to report. So they'll be filing both a Form 144 as well as a Form 5 related to this transaction. And once that happens, I mean, there are companies who get paid hundreds of thousands of dollars per client just to watch these deals, just to stay up to date on, it's called the Edgar system, which is the SEC's filing system. So we will know immediately once there is a bona fide intent to purchase, and we will know the exact amount of that purchase, the amount of shares that are being sold, and the nature of the transaction.
Is the transaction itself, how complicated is it? So say, like, hypothetical example, right? I don't know, Ineos come in and the bid's going to be 6 billion, right? So it's 6 billion. That means buying all the publicly available shares. That means buying out all the Glazers shares. How does that work? Is that just all done in one big old lump sum? Is it multiple transactions all happening at once?
So there are kind of multiple steps if that were the case. So this transaction can take place in two different ways. So the first one is, as you mentioned, full buyout. So they're buying all the publicly available shares. I would be very remiss insofar as I own some Manchester United stock. So I'll be sad to see it go, but I'll be much happier to see the Glazers go. And so that's option number one. If they take that option, then let's say it's Ineos, they'll have to exercise what's called a buyback option within their contract, and that's to repurchase the available public shares. So that's, shares that are held by, kind of day-to-day people.
Yeah.
In addition to that, there would also have to be the sale of the Glazer shares. That will take place via, a new contract that will come into place. That is going to be, to be honest, it's going to be a very, very complicated agreement. The lawyers are going to be, they probably already are, honestly, working, just around the clock to get that agreement put into place. It's going to include, in addition to kind of your typical due diligence, there will be contingencies put in there. So, for example, the SEC basically rubber stamps deals like this. American jurisprudence, as it relates to securities, is basically that the sun is the greatest disinfectant. It favors transparency. My professor in law school, who was an SEC enforcement agent, once said, you could sell dog shit to farmers, and as long as you told them it was dog shit, the SEC will sign off on it. And so, also, sorry about the language there. It's just, I thought that was
Nothing wrong with the
funny
shit
way.
here on the channel. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with the occasional swear. I swear quite a lot, I'll be honest. Sorry, everyone. Carry on, as you
were. But anyway, so basically transparency is key as it pertains to the SEC. Another contingency that we're definitely going to see in place in this contract, and this, frankly, in every contract, you have to have the authority to actually transfer, okay? And so here we're looking at the Premier League Review Board would be the best example. So we saw with Newcastle United, when the Saudis came in, there was, it was debatable as to whether they would actually be able to take control of the club. And so we'll be looking at something similar where built into this contract, there will be a contingency of Premier League approval for the new owners as well. And so there are several steps to this transaction. It is going to be complicated. The duty to report, the moment we'll know that a sale is on the cards, again, will be once there's that bona fide intent to purchase. So basically that means someone wants to buy it, they've got the money to buy it, and there's an agreement to buy it. That's when we'll be...
Does that announcement have to say, okay, Ineos are going to be, does it have to name the new purchaser? Does it have to name a purchase price? And does it have to name the percentage of the club that they are buying? So we would know at that point it would be a minority or majority. Is that a requirement for them?
So it's not necessarily, you can get the percentage out of it. The requirement is just the number of shares. So number of shares, purchase price, purchaser, and seller will all be named on that Form 144. However, they don't have to say, for example, the Glazers own, I believe it's 67% of Manchester United if you include Class A and Class B shares. So they won't have to say, for example, we're buying 67%. Instead, they'll say we're buying whatever number of shares it is. I can't remember off the top of my head.
It's like
But that number,
211 million. It's a lot. It's a lot of millions. It's a lot of millions of shares. That's all I know.
yeah. And so that's what will be reported, the raw number of shares, as well as the, again, purchase price, purchaser, seller. All of that will be filed on the Form 144 and again on the Form 5 10 days later.
At that point, when that announcement is made, in the same way when you're buying a house, there's a certain point that once I'm not sure it's when you exchange contracts. I think it's when you exchange contracts. That means you're going to be liable. If you were to pull out at that point, you're liable to pay a penalty. Is it at that point when the announcement's made to the FCC? Is it
SEC?
That one. Is it Securities Council? Something like that it was called?
Excuse me, Securities Exchange Commission.
Securities Exchange Commission. There you go, the SEC. So once it goes to the SEC point, that is where whoever that purchaser would be liable to a penalty if they didn't then go through with it, right? Is that what would happen?
So that would more be a matter of the contract itself. So once it's submitted to the SEC, basically the deal is signed, and we're at that point. So there are two dates that are relevant here. So there's the effective date and the closing date. The effective date takes place first. Normally, it's the same day that you sign the transaction. For purposes of SEC reporting, the effective date is when we're going to get that Form 144 filed, and then so from the effective date, that's where the agreement is basically binding and enforceable against both parties or all parties of it.
Would you say that this is the announcement that United fans are waiting for? It's whenever this SEC announcement is made and filed, that's when we can all say with complete confidence that Manchester United are actually going to have new owners.
So you'll have to excuse me. I looked up during that. I'm currently staying at a friend's house. I quite literally bought a bottle of champagne. I'm carrying it with me every time I travel, just for when this announcement happens. And so, yes, once that form is filed, don't get me wrong, mistakes can still happen. Deals can go awry, even in the closing. For example, this is, I hope I'm not too controversial of a thing to mention, but for example, with the Twitter purchase that Elon Musk did, you see him even at the effective date trying to pull out of the deal. So things like that can happen. Again, the contingencies are the really big one. It's likely that penalties would be built into the contract. However, those would just be basically liquidated damages or an agreement of just an agreement of a penalty amount via liquidated damage clause for pulling out of this deal.
And past the point of that announcement, how much work is still required to actually put the full process through? Is there a lot more? As a percentage, how far down the sale process does that announcement come, and how much work is left after it?
To be honest, it's hard to put a percentage on it. I would say 90%, maybe 95%.
That's good.
And so at that point, the biggest contingency, as I said, will be Premier League approval. This is particularly important if we're dealing with, nation state ownership, or there could be a potential view of a conflict of interest in the event that we get, a Saudi private fund attempting to purchase the club while the Saudi Arabian government has, the Saudi Arabian Investment Fund, I should say, for all intents and purposes, the Saudi government has Newcastle United as well. There could be a perception of conflict of interest that at that point there would have to be some lobbying to the Premier League itself, as well as all the owners who have, voting power. As it pertains to these transactions, that's the biggest hurdle. Once the Form 144 is filed, and then 10 days later, Form 5 is filed, the biggest hurdle is just going to be approval. Aside from that, pretty much all of the work is done. Hence, why when we get that form, bottle of champagne's coming out.
Champagne, baby. I don't even like champagne that much. It's overrated, genuinely. But I like it to celebrate. But look, Charles, I want to say a big thank you for giving me 20 minutes of your time today. For everybody who's been watching in the comments, I hope that this has helped you sort of get a bit of an overview of like what's coming ahead, what's in front of us. When it's basically when that announcement goes in is when we can start. Let's celebrate, and let's not celebrate too early until they literally aren't the owners of Manchester United anymore. But I hope that everybody's sort of learned a bit. Maybe me and Charles can speak again in the future if we need to. But yeah, thank you very much for your time today, dude.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on, Sam. I really appreciate it. Big fan of the channel, and keep up the great work, man.
Mate, thank you very much. Hopefully next time we speak, we'll have new owners. But yeah, I hope that this video has helped you. And yeah, take it easy, everyone. Have a good weekend. Bye.